Gentlemen, may I request you to please take your seats as we are about to begin shortly. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Pooja Pillai, Special Correspondent with the Indian Express, and it's a privilege to be here and welcome all of you to the 4th Ramnath Goenka Memorial Lecture presented by Samta Foundation in association with Wonder Cement and Vision IAS. The Indian Express launched the lecture in 2016, dedicated to its founder, Sri Ramnath Goenka. Some of our colleagues have put together a short audiovisual presentation, so can we just play that, please?
On Akshaya Tritiya of 1904, a boy was born in the Darbhanga village of Bihar, who would go on to change the face of politics and press in India. Ramnath Goenka moved to Calcutta as a teenager and was put under the tutelage of his maternal uncle, Mahadevlalji Dalmia. At 22, he moved to Madras to start trading in jute, but was known to be one of the many businessmen supporting the freedom movement in Chennai. Ramnathji grew inspired and moved by Gandhi's messages of non-violence. In 1932, in an answer to Gandhi's call for a pro-freedom English newspaper, the Indian Express was launched, which courageously gave voice to the millions of freedom fighters across the country. During the Quit India movement, when Gandhiji was arrested and the press given gagging orders, Ramnathji decided to suspend the publication of the Express, demanding Gandhi's release. He said,
"If we went on publishing, the Indian Express may be called a paper, but cannot be called a newspaper. We have therefore decided that this would be our last issue."
Recognized as a courageous freedom fighter, Ramnathji was one of the privileged members of the Constituent Assembly and tasked with drafting India's constitution. After independence, the Indian Express took to the role of nation building. Ramnathji engaged some of the world's most recognized editors to bring global standards in journalism to India. Here he's seen with Devdas Gandhi of Hindustan Times in London leading a delegation to form the Swadeshi News Agency, Press Trust of India. In the early 70s, when the country's most popular Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, split the Congress in Congress I and Congress O, he told her,
"You're making a big mistake, Indu."
She asked him.
Are you a friend or a foe?
He replied quickly.
"The choice is yours."
In 1975, Mrs. Gandhi declared emergency.
हमें अपनी आजादी कायम रखनी है.
Jayaprakash Narayan led the first revolution to fight the emergency with Ramnathji's full support. Through the emergency, the government's approach to the press was to tame or take over. Possibly, the most drastic step taken by the government was to send this notice to the Directorate of Advertising and Publicity to stop advertising in all Express Group publications. Unlike today, in the late 70s, the government was the largest advertiser in the country. This letter shows several fraudulent cases of income tax violations issued by the CBI against the Express. And here, the emotional letter Ramnathji wrote to KK Birla after the government forced him to resign from the board of his own company and appointed KK Birla as the chairman of the board. He wrote,
"Parting with the Express is like parting with my son. You said that if I don't fall in line with this proposal, all the members of my family would be held in detention under MISA."
During the emergency, all edits were vetted and cleared by the government. One day, when his edit was not cleared according to his liking, Ramnathji published a blank editorial. This blank edit page became a symbol of protest against press censorship around the world. But Ramnath Goenka could never be removed from the Express. He got back in control as soon as the emergency was removed. Here, at another attempt to control the free press, he took to the streets with placards. To encourage excellence in journalism, he instituted an award. And here is Swami Chinmayanand giving away the award to R.K. Lakshman. What will inspire journalists in India and around the world, however, will be his role as publisher of the country's most independent news organization, the Indian Express. And today, 25 years later, the Express continues to inspire independent journalism.
Ladies and gentlemen, this lecture, in the spirit of the founder and the newspaper, aims to enrich and shape public discourse through the power of ideas. No one exemplifies that better than Dr. S. Jaishankar, the Honorable Minister for External Affairs, who's our speaker this evening. Before we proceed, a request. Please, for the next hour or so, I urge you to just listen. And may I please also request you to put your cell phones on silent. Thank you. May I now request our Chief Editor, The Indian Express, Mr. Rajkamal Jha, to deliver the welcome address.
Thank you very much, Pooja. Minister for External Affairs, Dr. S. Jaishankar. Minister, Mr. V. Muralidharanji. Dr. S. Jaishankar, our chief guest and speaker this evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to a slightly unusual evening. Very, very unusual because we have all come here when the AQI is above 450. Most of us have come in even-numbered cars to listen. We don't get to do that much these days. It is also unusual because this is a lecture and a conversation. There is no this versus that. There is no contestation. There is no interrogation. There are a few TV cameras, but I guarantee you there is no TV anchor. In short, welcome to a space that is shrinking but is invaluable in our national conversations. Because at the Indian Express, that space is vital to our journalism. And it was to expand that space that we envisioned the Ramnath Goenka Lecture. For Ramnath ji deeply believed that to tell it like it is, we need to protect this space, whatever it takes. Indeed, our first RNG lectures by Dr. Raghuram Rajan, by President Pranab Mukherjee, and Justice Ranjan Gogoi, each lecture vindicated the need for that space because each foreshadowed an idea which is more relevant today than ever. Dr. Rajan on the need to distinguish between default and malfeasance in our stressed financial sector. Mr. Mukherjee, who cautioned us in the media that democracy shrinks if we cease to hear voices that are not our own. And Justice Gogoi, of course, his wonderful line that we need noisy judges and a judiciary on the front foot. That is why when we read headlines of protests in Hong Kong and Santiago, when we read the news about impeachment hearings in Washington and schools being shut in New Delhi because of bad air, they all tell stories of a changing world, and we could not have had a better choice for the fourth Ramnath Goenka Lecture than Dr. S. Jaishankar. A scholar diplomat, his diplomacy blends the hard nose with the soft touch. Be it in Moscow in the early 1980s, Sri Lanka in the IPKF years, Europe just after Berlin, Japan after Pokhran II when we were under sanctions, the nuclear deal when he got India out of the nuclear cold, his stints in Beijing and Washington, where he put in place the framework for border talks, his term as Foreign Secretary, and now as Minister, Jaishankar has been in the thick of what Shiv Shankar Menon in his book calls the contemporary fog. For Dr. Jaishankar, understanding the fog is equally important as navigating it. How much of the fog is water vapor, and to use a metaphor from our times, how much of it is suspended particulate matter? Or how much of the fog is just a blind spot in your eye? That is what his skill is. Last month, when he was in the US, we heard a series of his talks where he cut through that fog to help us look at the changing architecture of the old order and to give us a glimpse of the emerging contours of the new. He talked about a world where there are many more players, where there are many smaller players who punch far above their weight. He talked about a world where the metrics of power are changing, where perhaps the number of young people a country has matters more than the number of companies you have in Fortune 500, and where foreign policy is shaped by domestic policy, where a government with more than 300 seats in parliament may not need alliances at home, but has to follow a very challenging coalition dharma in the international order. In conversation with Dr. Jaishankar will be my colleague, Dr. C. Rajamohan, who is the contributing editor at the Indian Express and director of the Institute of Asian Studies in Singapore. Both of them, Dr. Rajamohan and Dr. Jaishankar, were at JNU in the late 70s. We are not going to ask them how much was their hostel fees. We may ask them that as well. But in a way, they have been students of each other. While doing their PhDs, they wrote 4 pieces on strategic issues. In fact, I was very lucky to read one of them just a couple of days ago. It was on how nature can be weaponized. It was after the war in Vietnam, and all this talk about rain and acid rain. Raja has kept his Express readers far ahead of others. We are very lucky to have him on board. He's caught the first straws in many a shifting wind. His Indo-US, Indo-US ties, on the seas as a stage for power, and more recently, he's been writing about, I'm sure many of you follow him, about how big tech and big data are shaping foreign policy. And at the same time, in Singapore, he's shaping the next generation of some of the world's finest South Asia scholars. We could not have had a better team to do justice to the subject of Dr. Jaishankar's lecture, going beyond the dogma of Delhi to help us understand India's foreign policy in a changing world. So please join me in welcoming Dr. S. Jaishankar to deliver the 4th Ramnath Goenka Lecture. Thank you.
Mr. Anant Goenka, my ministerial colleague, Muralidharan ji, Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, friends, it's a great privilege to deliver the 4th Ramnath Goenka Lecture. And as you all just heard, he had a well-deserved reputation for saying what needed to be said. So it is in that spirit that I address you all today. Albert Einstein is best known for his theory of relativity. Now, had he opted for a career in political science, he could have actually easily been known for a theory of insanity. His definition of that state of mind was doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. A corollary of that is to do the same thing in different situations and then expect the same results. This is important to recognize at a moment in world politics when many of our long-held assumptions no longer hold true. If the world is different, we need to think, talk, and engage accordingly. Falling back on the past is unlikely to help with the future. Now, the world is not just different. The very structure of the international order is undergoing a profound transformation. American nationalism, the rise of China, the saga of Brexit, and the rebalancing of the global economy are often cited as the more dramatic examples of change. In fact, the phenomenon is far more pervasive than just these illustrations. We have seen the return of old empires like Russia, Iran, or Turkey. The Middle East is in ferment, even by its exceptionally volatile standards. The centrality of ASEAN to Asia is not what it used to be. Demographic and economic trends in Africa are giving that continent a greater salience. South America is again a battleground for ideas. But we are also talking beyond geographies and orthodox politics. What defines power and determines national standing is also no longer the same. Technology, connectivity, and trade are at the heart of new contestations. In a more constrained and interdependent world, competition has to be pursued perforce more intelligently. The global commons is also more in disputation as multilateralism weakens. Even climate change is a factor contributing to geopolitics, amongst others, by the opening of an Arctic passage. In short, change is upon us as never before. Now, if the landscape looks very different today, so do India's partners. The relevance of the US or China is far more than any time earlier. The Russian relationship has defied odds by remaining incredibly steady. Japan has become an important factor in our calculations. The rediscovery of Europe is again underway, with France now as a critical strategic partner. The Gulf has been bridged in an extraordinarily effective manner. ASEAN has grown closer, and Australia's relevance is more apparent. Africa is today the focus of both development assistance and the opening of new embassies. And as you would have noted from the UN General Assembly, our outreach extends from South America and the Caribbean to the South Pacific and the Baltics. Closer home, there is an unprecedented investment in the neighborhood whose consequences are becoming apparent. Put together, the scale and intensity of our global engagement would be difficult to recognize for someone dealing with it even a few years ago. Now, if the issues and relationships are different, so too is the argumentation. So the first caution is to avoid obsessing about consistency, because it makes little sense in such changing circumstances. There's certainly a place for constants, but not to the extent of elevating them to immutable concepts. On the contrary, it is only by recognizing change that we are in a position to exploit opportunities. The purposeful pursuit of national interest in shifting global dynamics may not be easy, but it must be done. And the real obstacle to the rise of India is not anymore the barriers of the world, but the dogmas of Delhi. An ability to respond to a variety of situations is part of any nation's rise. But most agents of change encounter the accumulated wisdom of the entrenched or the passionate argumentation of the polarized. In India, we also meet an obsession with words. Form and process are often deemed more important than outcomes. Fortunately, discontinuous politics is helpful today in challenging past practices and frozen narratives. It does so taking into account the steady elements of any policy, in India's case, a persistent striving to expand space and options. Not an end in itself, that is meant to ensure greater prosperity at home, peace on the borders, protection of our people, and enhancing influence abroad. Now, obviously, our national strategy to realize even the more constant goals cannot be static in an evolving world. We know that well, having seen the world move from bipolarity to unipolarity and then to multipolarity. But changes in strategy also need to cater for greater capabilities, ambitions, and responsibilities, and most of all, for changed circumstances. In approaching such a world in transformation, we must recognize that assumptions need to be regularly revisited and calculations frequently revised. To do that, an accurate reading of recent history is essential. That exercise by itself can encourage appreciating the compulsions of responding to the environment rather than mechanically applying doctrines and concepts. Now, evidence strongly supports the view that India has advanced its interests effectively when it has made hard-headed assessments of contemporary geopolitics, and even more so when it did not hesitate to break with its past. The 1971 Bangladesh War, the 1992 economic and political repositioning, the 1998 nuclear tests, or the 2005 India-US nuclear deal are instructive examples. Indeed, it is only through a series of disruptions that India was able to bring about decisive shifts in its favor. In contrast, the pursuit of apparently consistent course, despite changing circumstances, often led us to lose the plot. This was the case with engaging China in the 1950s as part of a larger post-colonial front, even as political differences sharpened over a boundary dispute and a Tibet complication. The experience with Pakistan was similar, despite that country moving to greater reliance on terrorism. To some extent, this is a debate about realism and hard security. What it really suggests is the need for an unsentimental audit of Indian foreign policy. India's record includes dark moments like the 1962 defeat against China, or tense ones like the 1965 war with Pakistan, where the outcome hung in balance till the very end, and more triumphal ones such as the 1971 victory, which created Bangladesh. There are enough dichotomies in our past to generate a spirited debate on successes and failures. A misreading of geopolitics and economics up to 1991 stands out in contrast to the reformist policies thereafter. 2 decades of nuclear indecision ends dramatically with the tests of 1998. The lack of response to 2611 is so different from the Uri and Balakot operations. Whether it be events or trends, they all bear scrutiny for the lessons they hold. If we look back at this journey of independent India, the growth in its capabilities and influence should not conceal the missed chances and shortcomings. The roads not taken may often be an exercise in imagination, but equally, they are a sign of honest introspection. A power that is serious about self-improvement should not, I'm convinced, shrink from such an undertaking. How has Indian foreign policy evolved since independence? Understanding that is best done by dividing it into 6 broad phases, each a response to a very different strategic environment. The first phase, from 1946 to 62, could be characterized as an era of optimistic non-alignment. Its setting was very much of a bipolar world, with camps led by the United States and the Soviet Union. India's objectives were to resist the constraining of its choices and the dilution of its sovereignty as it rebuilt its economy and consolidated its integrity. Its parallel goal, as the first of the decolonized nations, was to lead Asia and Africa in a quest for a more equitable world order. This was the heyday of Bandung and Belgrade, the peak of Third World solidarity. It saw energetic Indian diplomacy from Korea and Vietnam to the Suez and Hungary. For a few years, our position on the world stage seemed assured. But the 1962 conflict with China not only brought this period to an end, but in a manner that significantly damaged India's standing. The second phase, from 1962 to 71, is a decade of realism and recovery. India made pragmatic choices on security and political challenges despite a paucity of resources. It looked beyond non-alignment in the interests of national security, concluding a now largely forgotten defense agreement with the United States in 1964. External pressures on Kashmir mounted in this period of vulnerability. The global context remained bipolar, but it now saw the emergence of limited cooperation between the US and USSR. South Asia happened to be a particular area of convergence, and Indian diplomacy had to face the superpowers together, as it did in Tashkent in 1965. It was also a period when domestic challenges were particularly acute, ranging from political turbulence to economic distress. But for our purposes, what is important is that even though the stress levels were very high, we came through an anxious period without too much damage. The third phase, from 1971 to 1991, was one of greater Indian regional assertion. It started with the decisive dismantlement of the India-Pakistan equivalence through the creation of Bangladesh, but ended with the IPKF misadventure in Sri Lanka. The larger environment by now was dramatically different, with the Sino-US rapprochement of 1971 upending the global strategic landscape. The Indo-Soviet Treaty and the adoption of more pro-Soviet positions on international issues were India's response to this challenge. It was a particularly complex phase, as the US-China-Pakistan axis, which came into being at this time, seriously threatened India's prospects. While they had many long-term consequences, the shift in India's posture came more from other factors: the collapse of the USSR, its close ally, and the not unconnected economic crisis in 1991 compelled us to look once again at the first principles of both domestic and foreign policy. The dissolution of the USSR and the emergence of a unipolar world characterized the fourth phase. It encouraged a radical rethink in India on a broad range of issues, and it shifted focus to safeguarding strategic autonomy. If India opened up economically more to the world, its reflection was also evident in new diplomatic priorities and approaches. The Look East policy summarized the change Indian approach to world affairs, which also saw adjustments in its position on Israel. This is a period where India reached out to engage the US more intensively, yet did so while protecting its equities in critical areas. This quest for strategic autonomy was particularly focused on securing its nuclear weapon option, but also was visible in trade negotiations. By the turn of the century, enough had happened for India to shift gear again and move to a higher level. After 1998, it was now a declared nuclear weapon power, had fended off Pakistan's military adventurism again in Kargil in 1999, generated enough economic growth to be of global interest, and managed well a United States that was focusing more on developments in Asia and consequences of Islamic fundamentalism. This more competitive environment opened up new windows of opportunity for India, especially as the US found it difficult to maintain the same degree of unipolarity. As a consequence, India discovered the benefits of working with different powers on different issues. This fifth phase is one where India gradually acquires the attributes of a balancing power. It is reflected in the India-US nuclear deal, as well as a better understanding with the West at large. At the same time, India could also make common cause with China on climate change and trade, and consolidate further ties with Russia while helping to fashion BRICS into a major forum. This was, in some senses, a period of opportunity where India moved the global needle by taking new positions. A number of developments came together to change calculations by 2014, initiating the sixth phase. To begin with, China gathered more momentum, and the terms of engagement it offered to the world progressively hardened. Balancing works best during a period of transition and was therefore inevitably mitigated as new realities took root. At the other extreme, the American trumpet sounded increasingly uncertain. US resource limitation was aggravated by risk aversion in the aftermath of the Iraq War. Declaring an Afghan withdrawal and displaying tepidity in the Asia-Pacific sent messages well beyond the immediate issues. For its part, Europe too turned increasingly inwards, not appreciating that political agnosticism would have its own cost. Japan's effort to acquire a greater say continued to unfold only gradually. The full impact of the 2008 financial crisis and the global economic rebalancing made itself felt in a variety of ways. As the world saw a wider dispersal of power and more localized equations, it was evident that multipolarity was now seriously upon us. Clearly, this called for a very different approach than practicing politics with a limited set of dominant players. Faced with all these developments and assessing the state of global regimes and coalitions, India chose to turn to more energetic diplomacy. It did so recognizing that we are entering a world of convergences and issue-based arrangements. This awareness was accompanied by a growing sense of its own capabilities. What it brought out was not just the limitations of others, but the expectations that the world has of India. That we have emerged among the major economies of the world is one factor, admittedly the most important. But the relevance of our talent to global technology is another, one likely to grow in time. Our ability to shoulder greater responsibilities at a time when the world is more reticent is also evident. Equally significant is a willingness to shape key global negotiations, such as in Paris on climate change. The investment of greater resources in development partnerships with countries of the South was also noteworthy. And not least, the manner in which we have approached our own region and the extended neighborhood has resonated beyond. India's diplomatic agenda has broadened considerably, as indeed have its partners in those endeavors. We share with the international community the objective that a multipolar world should have a multipolar Asia as its core. And to ensure that, India needs to follow an approach of working with multiple partners on different agendas. Obviously, they would each have their own importance and priority. But Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas is today as relevant in foreign policy. It is the nations who have an optimal mix of capabilities, relationships, and positioning who can aspire to occupy the multiple poles of the emerging international order. And it is the confidence of being able to forge ahead in this looser architecture that can inspire us to emerge as a leading power in the future. Now, each of these 6 phases have had their highs and lows. In fact, the ending of one could well be the beginning of another. The 1971 Bangladesh War or the 1998 nuclear test stand out in the positive category, but it is actually the negative ones that perhaps are more directly responsible for substantial changes of course. The 1962 reverse vis-à-vis China was one such example. The combination of events as diverse as the Gulf War, the breakup of the USSR, economic stagnation, and domestic turbulence coming together in 1991 was another. Therefore, while not being dogmatic about the past, it is just as important not to be dismissive about it. This is crucial to appreciate because there are both strains of continuity and change in our policy. Conceptually, each period could be visualized as an overlay on the previous one rather than either a negation or just an extrapolation. Thus, the independent mindset that drove non-alignment and then protected our strategic equities can today be better expressed in multiple partnerships. So what does the past teach us? 7 decades of foreign policy certainly offer a lot of lessons, especially if we contemplate the challenging road ahead. They span a very broad spectrum, both in time and in outcomes. A dispassionate assessment of our performance would note that while we have done well in some respects, many competitors have done much better. Overcoming many challenges, India consolidated its national unity and integrity. That was not a given, noting that other diverse societies like the USSR and Yugoslavia did not make it in the same period. A modern economy with industrial capacities was developed over time, even as our reliance on nature was mitigated in agriculture. Defense preparedness was improved, and one of the key accomplishments of diplomacy, in fact, was to enable access to multiple sources of equipment and technology. However, the fact remains that even after 7 decades of independence, many of our borders remain unsettled. In the economic sphere, we may look good when benchmarked against our own past. It seems a little different when compared to China or Southeast Asia. So what really matters is to develop a sharp awareness about our own performance. And the lessons of that exercise can be captured in 5 baskets of issues. The first relates to the need for greater realism in policy. International relations are very much a test of will. Swami Vivekananda perceptively described the world as a gymnasium where nations come to make themselves strong. Particularly in the face of optimistic non-alignment, perhaps even later, our focus on diplomatic visibility sometimes led to overlooking the harsher realities of hard security. The early misreading of Pakistan's intentions can perhaps be explained away by a lack of experience. But the reluctance to attach overriding priority to securing borders, even a decade later, is much more difficult to justify. It is not just that the challenges of 1962 were unanticipated. It was more that a diplomacy focused on world politics did not give it the primacy it deserved. Somewhere, there was an implicit but deeply entrenched belief that India's high standing in world affairs was protection enough against global turbulence and competitive politics. It was therefore at some cost we discovered that outcomes can be decided as much on the field as at conferences. This is a relevant takeaway even now, despite having entered a more constrained world. Interestingly, it is not that India always shrank from applications of force when required. Hyderabad in 1948 and Goa in 1961 are illustrative examples, as indeed is Kashmir when it was attacked by Pakistan. But having so strongly built up an image of a reluctant power, we also ended up influenced by our own narrative. Due to that, we rarely prepared for security situations with the sense of mission that many of our competitors displayed. Discomfort with hard power was reflected in lack of adequate consultation with the military, most notably during the 1962 conflict. The creation of the post of Chief of Defense Staff half a century later shows a very different mindset. Judgments of the past that overlook security implications are also worth studying. An overemphasis on diplomacy led to a lack of understanding of the behavior of other polities. The Cold War, for example, was seen more as an argumentation when the reality was a ruthless exercise of power. There was also little awareness in the 1950s that we were dealing with a battle-hardened neighbor to the north, or indeed of the strategic significance of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. This approach to the world affairs continued even thereafter. Thus, in 1972 at Shimla, India chose to bet on an optimistic outlook on Pakistan. At the end of the day, it resulted in both a revanchist Pakistan and a continuing problem in Jammu and Kashmir. That it has taken us so long to link talks with Pakistan to cessation of terrorism speaks for itself. Without overstating the argument, a case can certainly be made for a more grounded Indian approach to international relations. The economic counterpart of these concerns constitute a second basket. If one considers all the major growth stories since 1945, a common feature was the extraordinary focus that they put on leveraging the global environment. China did that with great effect, initially with the USSR and then with the United States and the West. The Asian tiger economies practiced it as well, using Japan, the US, and then China successively to build themselves. That is how India too approached its various relationships in the last 7 decades, but not always with the same single-mindedness. Nevertheless, much of India's industrialization and capacities in other domains were direct achievements of collaborations enabled by diplomacy. Steel, nuclear industry, higher education, and computing are among the examples. This held true even more for the post-1991 reform period and the shift eastward of India's center of gravity. The interconnection between diplomacy, strategy, and economic capabilities is, however, not self-evident. As in security, it is important to distinguish between cause and effect. The economy drives diplomacy, not the other way around. Few would argue that the reforms of the 1990s and greater openness have served us well. But as we then extrapolated it into free trade arrangements with Southeast Asia and East Asia, the proposition has become more challengeable. Blame it on structural rigidities, limited competitiveness, inadequate exploitation of opportunities, or just plain unfair practices. The growing deficit numbers in trade are today a stark reality. More importantly, their negative impact on industry at home is impossible to deny. And China, of course, poses a special trade challenge even without an FTA. In this background, the recent debate about the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, offers lessons in foreign policy as much as in the trade domain. On the one hand, we should not go back to the old dogmas of economic autarky and import substitution. But at the same time, embracing the new dogma of globalization without a cost-benefit analysis is equally dangerous. What we saw in Bangkok recently was a clear-eyed calculation of the gains and costs of entering a new arrangement. We negotiated till the very end, as indeed we should. But then, knowing what was on offer, we took a call. And that call was that no agreement at this time was better than a bad agreement. It is also important to recognize what the RCEP is not. It is not about stepping back from the Act East policy, which in any case is deeply rooted in distant and contemporary history. Our cooperation spans so many domains that this one decision does not really undermine the basics. Even in trade, India already has FTAs with 12 out of the 15 RCEP partners, nor is there really a connection with our Indo-Pacific approach, as that goes well beyond the RCEP membership. There can be a legitimate debate on the merits of joining RCEP or any other FTA for that matter. Just don't confuse it for grand strategy. Any quest to maximize options and expand space naturally require engaging multiple players. Conceptually, this third basket is a given in Indian foreign policy, since there is a basic consensus about nurturing our independence. While it has served us very well in the first decade of a bipolar world, we also discovered the associated dangers of being left short on all accounts. As India saw in 1962, the best of both worlds is easier imagined than realized. In the periods thereafter, the distance from one pole was also not automatically compensated by the other. Sometimes, global circumstances required us, as in 1971, to lean on one side, just as China did in 1950 and 1971. As a general rule, extracting more from the international system depends on the bigger picture, and a zero-sum game cannot be an assumption. Indeed, a particularly disturbing scenario that nations like India and China faced in the 1960s was the prospect of the superpowers finding common ground. That is why the talk of a G2, even decades later, creates such deep unease again in so many quarters. Hedging is a delicate exercise, whether it is non-alignment, strategic autonomy of earlier periods, or multiple engagements of the future. But there's no getting away from it in a multipolar world. This is a game best played on the front foot, appreciating that progress on any one front strengthens one's hand on all others. In that sense, it is like having many balls up in the air and displaying the confidence and the dexterity to drop none. To the uninitiated or the anachronistic, the pursuit of apparently contradictory objectives and approaches may seem baffling. How do you reconcile Howdy Modi, a Mamallapuram, and a Vladivostok? Or the RIC, Russia, India, China, with the J, Japan, America, India? Or the Quad, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Or an Iran with a Saudi Arabia? Or an Israel with a Palestine? The answer is in a willingness to look beyond dogma and enter the real world of convergences. Think of it not as arithmetic, but as calculus. This new game is a challenge for practitioners and analysts alike, but one that must be mastered to forge ahead. Now, risk-taking is an inherent aspect of diplomacy, and most policy judgments revolve around its mechanics. It is also a natural accompaniment to hedging. When we look at this fourth basket, it is evident that a low-risk foreign policy is only likely to produce limited rewards. On occasions when India departed from this mode, some risks paid off and some did not. We had laid out our broad foreign policy approach as early as 1946 and developed that framework as time went on. Although India came under pressure in 1962 and 1971, it limited the compromise it had to make and sought to revert to an earlier posture as soon as it could. Over the course of its ties, it introduced new concepts and terms to deal with emerging issues, but without necessarily abandoning the earlier ones. The cumulative impression of this was therefore of a steady and middle-of-the-road approach that gathered greater substance as India's influence grew. But having noted that, the truth is also that ascending up the global ladder did require taking big calls that were conventional or nuclear, political or economic. Not all risks are necessarily dramatic. Many just require the confident calculations and determined follow-up of day-to-day management, but their aggregate impact can result in quantum jump in global positioning. To a certain degree, we see that happening today. Now, the fifth basket is actually a return to the diplomatic primer, reading the global tea leaves right. The foreign policy of all nations is set against the backdrop of global contradictions. They reflect an assessment of opportunities and compulsions and of risks and rewards. Even if we are to get our immediate situation right, a misreading of the larger landscape can prove costly. In our own case, going to the United Nations on Jammu and Kashmir clearly misread the intent of the Anglo-American alliance then and of the seriousness of the Cold War. Years later, our early awareness of the Sino-Soviet differences did not mature on our expected timelines. And in the 1960s, the 1980s, and again after 2001, we grossly underestimated the relevance of Pakistan to American and Chinese global strategy. This is not to suggest that India has not had its successes. Indo-Soviet and later Indo-Russian relations are a direct product of our global strategizing. After 1991, so too has been the adjustment of our policy towards the United States. Both the Indo-Soviet Treaty and the India-US nuclear deal were outcomes of a larger reading of the world. That is the case with correctives introduced in respect of the US in 1973 and China in 1976 to overcome the polarization that had been created by the 1971 situation. Identifying opportunities thrown up by the structure of world politics can also help mitigate risks. We saw that, for example, in respect of France after the 1998 nuclear tests. Today, an appreciation of world politics must include a proper understanding of Sino-US contradictions, of growing multipolarity, of weaker multilateralism, of larger economic and political rebalancing, of greater space for regional powers, and of the world of convergences. Each of them is a factor in driving the policy initiatives of the present era, whether it is our outreach to the Gulf, the advocacy of Indo-Pacific, or the more vigorous engagement with Europe. They represent a facet of our larger repositioning. So what are the prospects of the sixth phase that is now underway? A changing world is clearly a more actionable one for those who do not wish to get left behind. As Rabindranath Tagore declared, you cannot cross the sea merely by standing and staring at the water. For a beginning, it requires a thinking that keeps up with the times. A clearer definition of interests is the next step, and the determined pursuit of that, the one thereafter. We see that today, for example, in a better appreciation of our maritime geography and the Sagar doctrine. When confronted by security challenges, this India has also responded with a new grit. Its enthusiasm for shaping global conversations on climate change, terrorism, connectivity, and maritime security is already having an impact. The humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations undertaken in Yemen, Nepal, Iraq, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Fiji, and Mozambique are statements of capability as much as of responsibility. Its election-winning record in international organizations is another important statement. Expanded offers of development assistance have been accompanied by an improved record of project execution. The neighborhood in Africa will surely testify to that change. India's branding has become much stronger, including the International Day of Yoga, the International Solar Alliance, and most recently, the Initiative for a Coalition of the Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. So, while the previous phases of foreign policy each have a neat description, how do we categorize the current one? Part of the challenge is that we are still in the early phase of a major transition. The contours of even the near future are not yet clear. One solution is to anchor it on Indian aspirations and speak of our goal of emerging as a leading power. Now, the problem with that is that others tend to think of it as a statement of arrival rather than a goal on the horizon. Taking off from non-alignment, we could perhaps speak today of multi-alignment. It appears energetic, it appears participative, and compared to an earlier posture of abstention or non-involvement, it certainly sounds very much more vigorous. But the difficulty is it also appears very opportunistic, whereas India is really seeking strategic convergence rather than tactical convenience. Putting India first, may be another way of capturing a strong and pragmatic policy outlook. But this also suffers from a comparison with other nations, some of whom have chosen to be very self-centered. In India's case, nationalism has in fact led to greater internationalism. Advancing prosperity and influence may be a fair description, but is not exactly a catchword. So perhaps we need to accept the reality that a single phrase may elude us for some time in the midst of global uncertainty. Now, as we stand poised to move to the next level, we could also ask ourselves, did we lose valuable time in doing so? Such queries are often a product of hindsight and may lack context. But nevertheless, there are issues that could be pondered about, especially if we speak of outcomes of judgment rather than of circumstances. Our ties with China are a natural beginning for such a discussion. Should India, for example, have brought the boundary issue to head in 1950 itself? Could the border conflict of 1962 have been avoided by a compromise in 1960 when Zhou Enlai came to India? With the United States, did our cultural antipathy in the initial years aggravate the sense of distance? On economic issues, perhaps there is more consensus that India should have followed the example of the ASEAN and China and opened up a decade earlier than it did. But on the strategic side, the delay in its self-declaration as a nuclear weapon power from 1974 to 1998 may well have been the worst of all worlds. Were we prisoners to paper, a trait that came close to wrecking the 2005 nuclear deal as well? Our past handling of Pakistan, a society which we are supposed to know well, also raises many questions. These are not exactly hypothetical situations and are cited to underline the contention that emergence as a leading power requires great pragmatism. That can be further strengthened by more sophisticated narratives that can help reconcile divergences. After all, our emphasis on sovereignty has not prevented us from responding to human rights situations in our neighborhood, and nor indeed have steps that India has taken to ensure its integrity and promote its security, whether in Hyderabad, Goa, or abroad in Sri Lanka or Maldives, made us less multilateral. Now, this talk is about dogma, and entrenched views are naturally strongest on the most perennial challenges. In the case of India, it will come as no surprise to any of you that this relates to Pakistan. Changes in thinking will trigger a debate, and that has been the case for the past few years. The fact is that we have allowed the narrative to focus mainly on a dialogue when the real issue was stopping cross-border terrorism. Dogma treats every new approach as an unjustified deviation. In the last 5 years, however, a different normal has developed, and global conversations on cross-border terrorism have become more serious. Just look at the FATF as proof of that assertion. As we move decisively to combat separatism in Jammu and Kashmir, there is some talk today of its internationalization and hyphenation of our ties with Pakistan. This is thinking from the past, reflecting neither the strength of India, the mood of the nation, nor the determination of the government. Uninformed comments abroad or on our internal affairs is hardly internationalization. And the reputational and real differences between India and Pakistan will always put paid to any hyphenation effort. In reality, these fears are but a thinly disguised advocacy of inaction. Their intent, conscious or otherwise, is to legitimize a status quo that has now been overtaken by history. The balance sheet for India's foreign policy after 7 decades presents a mixed picture. National development is at the heart of any assessment, and it is difficult to quarrel with the view that there has been significant progress, but not enough. The comparison with what China achieved in the same period is sobering. Reading the global tea leaves right, and then leveraging the international situation could have gone better. Indeed, the mantra of unchanging foreign policy axioms has discouraged an honest review of our performance and the introduction of timely correctives. Diligence and debate have not been as rigorous as they should have been for an aspiring player. When combined with the hesitations of history, it has led to unexplored avenues and unrealized outcomes. But we are now at a cusp of change. With more confidence, the pursuit of seemingly divergent goals and the straddling of contradictions are being attempted. Taking risks is inherent to the realization of ambitions. A nation that has the aspiration to become a leading power someday cannot continue with unsettled borders and an unintegrated region and underexploited opportunities. Above all, it cannot be dogmatic, approaching a visibly changing world order. Napoleon once said that history is a version of past events that people have decided to agree upon. The world that awaits us not only calls for fresh thinking, but eventually a new consensus at home as well. Putting dogmas behind us is a starting point for that journey. Thank you very much. Glass of water.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaishankar, for that very insightful lecture that helps us understand India's place in the changing world. Would you please take a seat on the stage? I would now like to invite Dr. C. Raja Mohan, contributing editor, The Indian Express, and director, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, on stage for a very special conversation with Dr. Jaishankar.
Expansive lecture. You spoke, you gave us a different way of thinking about India's role in a changing world. There are a lot of issues to take up with you, and there are some arguments to be had. Right. So let me cover some. Yeah, let me have some broad areas, for example, on the general orientation of Indian diplomacy at this stage, the question of non-alignment and great power relations, the neighborhood, extended neighborhood issues, multilateralism, and then some specific new challenges that are emerging for Indian diplomacy. To start with, you laid out a fabulous assessment of India's situation today, India's condition, if you like. One of the changes, many changes you talked about, is India's own position in the international system has changed. It has become a stronger nation. Its relative weight in the international system has grown. But the challenges you face, for example, you talked about a multipolar world. Raj Kamal Jha talked about the fog. If you're trying to cross the sea and there is fog, then the whole issue comes down to judgment. And that means actually in the day-to-day conduct of your diplomacy, how do you translate this broad framework to break away from the old dogmas and deal with the world as it is at this point, given the uncertainties abroad and the advantages that you have as a stronger nation?
I think there are a number of factors, and you can see them at play. The first is to understand the world. And to understand the world, it's important to understand the players, the key players. So if you have a foreign policy which is inactive in terms of engagements, and really one of our, I just came from Serbia, and I was honestly embarrassed to learn that I was the first foreign minister who had ever visited Serbia after it broke away from Yugoslavia. Now, and mind you, that was not an exception. I hear this story over and over again. And it's just not at the foreign minister's level. It can go higher, it can go lower. So the first is, to be visible, to be active, to engage, to be able to, to kind of hear, smell, touch the world for yourself. If you don't do that, your instincts are not going to be good. They're not going to be sound. The second, I think, is an issue of, confidence, and confidence grounded, obviously, on realism. But a large part, the earlier phases when we speak about non-alignment and strategic autonomy, that was an era where we were the global power, our power position vis-a-vis the world. We were relatively defensive because, the whole idea was don't get run over by the big guy. And if you've got something valuable, make sure he doesn't take it away from you. I think today we moved beyond that era. We are able to step out, look at opportunities, look at the big negotiations, say, this is in my interest, I get that outcome. Not get into an abstention ducking mode. So it's frankly, at the end of the day, it's a mindset issue.
Can you convince your ministry? Because there's a general sense, look, Indian foreign policy apparatus tends to be slow, hesitant, not easy to pull this vehicle. How do you change that?
Oh, I think, frankly, now this is at the risk of offending a lot of people out there. Look, the reality is track one in India has always, not always, at least in the recent past, and I say this for the last 20 years, track one in India has always been ahead of track two. That if you look at the big opportunities of change, whatever has come our way, it's actually the official dumb which has sort of identified it, grasped it, exploited it, and often got criticism from the press for doing all that. So I think today, as someone who's spent 40 years in bureaucracy and is seeing today the ministry, part of me is, yes, I'm a minister, but I'm also a product of that ministry. I'm very, very confident about how the human resources and the mindset of diplomats is shaping up. And, look back at the last, even the last few weeks and months. When presented with any situation, you had this, for example, in New York, when there was the Security Council consultation on 370. You had our ambassadors speaking up and contesting what was said very confidently. So I think you have to realize that is changing. Now, that may not make good press, but that's the reality.
So the second question I had in relation to diplomacy is, on the one hand, I think you have a historic opportunity to represent a very strong India that, from your own narrative just now, it's willing to confront problems that were left unattended for a long time, the question of terrorism in Pakistan, or the question of what happened in Dhokla, that you, on the one hand, you have this ability to take very decisive steps and risk-taking that you talked about. We've seen a lot of good things happen on the advance of the relationship with the US, the settling of the Bangladesh boundary dispute, and we've seen the capacity of the government to do more things. But there is also the view that the government has taken too many risks. So how would you address that criticism that, look, too much of risk-taking has put you in a more difficult situation vis-a-vis 370, or how are you dealing with the Pakistan question today?
No, I addressed it partly in the example, at least, that you raised. I addressed partly in my remarks, but let me address the generic proposition. You take any region today, in a lot of regions, because today that overarching sort of big power discipline has diluted, you have many more regional contradictions. Look at the Gulf, for example. Now, if you are not prepared to take risks, you'll end up actually doing nothing. And doing nothing is not going to win you friends. It's not going to improve your influence. So I think the issue for us, look at the Indian character, okay? I would rarely fault Indians for taking risks. I would mostly fault them for timidity. You know, a Sehwag is a sort of exception. He is not the rule. So my point is that today's world and your position today, you are today what, the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. You have 32, 34 million Indians and people of Indian origin outside. You have to defend your interests in a variety of ways. Now, you can't sit at home and say somebody else will do that, because that somebody is less and less visible today. So I think the state of the world itself is going to sort of pull you out of the crease in many ways. And, as regards the example you mentioned, Article 370, look, I would caution you on 2 points. One, please differentiate between the reaction of governments and, the chatter of media, social media or print media. There's a very big difference. The second is, to some extent, this is our, shall I say, debate within the country, which often gets linked with other people's debates outside. And what you often see are not policy assessments, but frankly polemics. So I would take polemics with more than a grain of salt.
Now, while you got a strong government, you're in a position to do big things that were considered too risky in the past. There is also seemed to be a problem in the conduct of foreign policy and diplomacy at this stage, which is the narrative about India seems to be changing. There is the economic slowdown on the one hand. So much of the India's rise story was built on the fact that India was growing at a reasonable clip, and a slowdown begins to create one set of problems. The other is the argument, look, what's happening inside the country, whether it's in Kashmir or the NRC issue, is India losing its traditional sense of, what you talked about, India's brand? Are we losing some of that brand in the current situation? So both on the economic front as a rising economy, and on the internally how Indian democracy is perceived.
Look, I would try to be objective about that. I think just because you had 2 quarters of slower growth, we've been through slower growth periods before. So I think I was, in fact, where was it? This was at the East Asia Summit, okay? And I don't want to reveal confidences, but essentially what I was hearing from people institutions which had studied our growth was that they seem to be fairly confident that you're going to see a recovery, an improvement fairly soon. So I think we shouldn't be that faint-hearted that two quarters of slowdown you suddenly start thinking that the world is coming to an end. I think we've been through that before. Regarding the other issues you mentioned, 370 or NRC. Look, again, I'd be very frank with you. I think a lot of it is ideological debate within this country. There is liberal fundamentalism at work. If you look at some of the media coverage that you see, you can see that. I've actually seen very really top-line publications actually suggesting that the NRC issue started with this government, which actually shows you how strongly prejudice can override diligence. So when people omit facts of history, even the 370, the point I keep making, 370 was temporary, but how many people say that? They don't say that not because they don't know that. They don't say that because it doesn't suit them to say that. So, I would, I'd put it this way, my reputation is not decided by a newspaper in New York.
So you're confident that, but you're confident that some of the opposition you hear from the liberal voices internationally is something through engagement that you can overcome, make the rest of the world see?
Raj, you and I went through the nuclear test. Yeah. Did you get overwhelming approval from the rest of the world? So, I mean, look, if you do things which changes the status quo, I mean, you had 70 years of problem in Kashmir, okay? Now you have started a major policy of change, which promises a very different future. Now, while we are looking at it from the point of view of what it means to Kashmir, development, integration, etc., remember from a very cold power politics, a lot of people are looking at the possibility that a vulnerability which has been exploited by world for 70 years may no longer be available for exploitation. Now, you're not, obviously they're going to keep it alive to the extent they can. So I don't think it's that disinterested either.
No, that brings me to the second set of issues I thought we could talk about, which is really the great power relations. You expanded on some length in your presentation. And much of the argument about non-alignment, strategic autonomy, a lot of it is really how we relate to the major powers in the international system. Now, you posited that, look, there is a multipolar world, we are stronger than before. So in engaging all these players, you talked about simultaneously doing engagement with all the powers, many balls in the air, if you will. But at the operational level, you see, for example, with China, is it cooperation, is it competition? If the imbalance between China and the US has grown, China and India has grown dramatically, so what is the answer that you have to deal with this imbalance that has emerged? Because compared to the 90s when we were roughly equal, today Chinese GDP is almost 5 times bigger than ours.
See, I mean, first of all, I mean, this is not a remark restricted to China. I think a lot of our relationships are going to see both competition and cooperation, because that is today the nature of the world. I mean, even among, we are going to have competition from powers with whom we have very good relations, and we're going to find common ground with powers with whom we may have differences. So the world is going to be shades of gray, and how to play that again, you're not going to get clean, neat lines and solutions. I think the issue with China is particularly complex because, as you say, there's been a shift in the power balance. I mean, I think just as a useful reminder, I think the per capita incomes of the two countries were about the same. Maybe we were a little ahead when Rajiv Gandhi visited China, and see the difference today. I mean, put that aside. I mean, that's why I said we need a performance review of ourselves as well. But the fact is that part of, in international relations, people are not going to do you the favor of coming to your size or your capability. I mean, you will have to deal with countries smaller than you. You'll have to deal with people much bigger than you. So a lot of that is going to call for diplomatic skills. Our challenge is this. You see, vis-a-vis the world, we have risen. Okay? I mean, there's hardly anywhere in the world where you go and when they think of India today versus India 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they say, yes, you've grown much bigger. The challenge for us with China is in the same period, because China has risen 5 times as faster. Our rise doesn't have the same resonance in China which it would have in any other part of the world. Now, I think some of that is changing. Some of that is changing because even with a lesser rise, if I play a defter hand, I can make myself felt, which means, again, I have to see where international relations, the larger landscape gives me possibilities. But that is why, when I look at the last few years, I attach great importance. I mean, not just me, but I think the government as well, to those conversation format meetings that we've had at Chennai and at Wuhan, because actually we are now engaging China on the state of the world. And the last time we did that, I think, was in the 1950s.
The US, the transformation of the relationship with the US has been one of the significant achievements. I mean, from 1991, and your government, both where you served in the previous one as the foreign secretary, ended a lot of the hesitations. I mean, what the Prime Minister himself called the historic hesitations, completing the nuclear deal, expanding security cooperation, working with them through Quad and various forms. But are we beginning to run into problems with the US as well, with what we've seen in the last 2 years with the Trump administration on trade issues, on range in Afghanistan, etc.?
Look, I think if we were to run into more challenges vis-a-vis the US, first of all, we wouldn't be alone. I think most of the world would be in a similar situation. But I think frankly in our case, that is vastly overstated. Let me tell you how I see the problem. I think actually in a whole range of areas, we have today much stronger convergence and cooperation. And it's interesting. We have put hesitations of history behind us, but people don't understand that the Trump administration has also done so. I mean, what I've seen with Trump in the last 2 or 3 years, was not at all the traditional American system at work. You actually got, big, bold, decisive steps in a range of areas. So, to me, the possibilities of moving are there, but we have to appreciate 2 or 3 issues. One, when it comes to trade, you have administration with a fundamentally different view of trade and what trade means to national security. They define national security as economic security and economic security as a trade surplus. So if that is the thinking, then obviously there will be issues. Now, to me, I don't have a problem with trade friction. The only way you won't have trade friction is if you don't trade with people. Normal countries, normal trading countries have trade frictions with everybody. The Americans have it with the Japanese, the Europeans have it with the Americans have it with the Koreans. I mean, that's the nature of trade. So I would not, I think in this country there's almost a sort of a desire to see a problem and to exaggerate it beyond belief, as a way of saying, well, see, things are going badly. My sense is, yes, we have trade issues. In fact, today our trade minister, commerce minister, is there talking to US trade representative. But I'm reasonably confident. I mean, that has not prevented the rest of our relationship from moving. But on Afghanistan, we also have to understand one thing. The United States has been fighting there for 18 years. And 18 years is a long time to fight a war. I mean, show me the last time a country fought for 18 years. It was, it's somewhere fairly deep in history. So for us to expect a, continuation of the American posture, I think that would be unrealistic in our reading of the United States or frankly of any other power.
One of the things we've seen, I think you just come back from Europe, I see there's much greater engagement with Europe, and you mentioned that in your speech. But more broadly about the West as a whole, I think when during your US visit, you said India needs a new compact with the West. Mm-hmm. So this is very different. I think last 20 odd years we've been saying, look, West likes India, India likes West. But what you said is, look, the terms of engagement between India and the West must also change. So what did you mean by saying we need a new compact with the West?
Well, look, in many ways, we have very strong convergences with the West. We are market economies, we are political democracies, we are pluralistic societies. A lot of our institutions are shaped by our interaction with the West in the past. So that's the common bit, okay? Now, and the fact is the West has not treated us well in these last 70 years. A lot of our problems also arose from the West, especially our security problems. Now, having said that, what we have seen in maybe the last 15, 20 years, I would say certainly after the nuclear test, has been diplomatic initiatives which have aimed at creating a new, more positive basis for the relationship. But the West is the West. They have 2 centuries of dominance. So they have to accept that today life is not what it was. Life is not what it was 200 years ago for sure, but not even what it was 20 years ago. That with the passage of time, with every decade, there is going to be the equation, the power balance between India and individual or collective Western countries will change. So their expectation that somewhere, I see sometimes, attempts at passing judgments and making very condescending comments. I mean, look, that's for me history. And they have got to understand that today, we are in a different position, they are in a different position. Frankly, we need each other, for sure, I agree. But we have to find that sort of way of making it work for both of us.
One of the things you said during your US visit, I mean, it's quite a new term, that India is a southwestern power, partly saying, you're not giving up your equities in the non-aligned movement.
And the South came before the West, huh?
Yeah, southwestern. So now, what exactly do you mean by a southwestern power?
Because, why I said it? I said it partly because I think I was at the Atlantic Council, okay? The Atlantic Council is it's a Euro-Atlantic organization pushing the Western agenda. Now, often the question you get asked is, are you a Western power, are you an Eastern power, because they think of their bipolarity as the only criteria which there is in the world to differentiate countries. Now, the fact is there may be an East-West criteria, there's a North-South criteria as well. And when you look today at the big international negotiations, I think you realize whether it is trade, whether it's climate change, whether sometimes it's just sheer politics, that a lot of countries of the South actually look to India. They look to India because all said and done, we were the first of the decolonized nations. We were politically active. There's a whole history out there, and a continuous history over 70 odd years. So, and I think today that's a very powerful constituency we have. And whether we go up in the world, it's important we nurture that constituency, because I think when I look at India as a potentially global, when I say lead, one aspiration to be a leading power, if I were to, for example, have a stronger relationship with Africa, I would like to cultivate the southern constituency. I would like to be responsive to their needs. I would not like to replace the northern powers. I would like to be a partner rather than a substitute of an earlier arrangement. And I think, if you look today, I made that statement about winning international elections. Think back, two years ago, we actually defeated a P5 country in a UN election, which was not a small thing. And why did it happen? Because the countries of the South felt very strongly for you. So now I'm putting it beyond elections, I'm citing that as an example. But I think it's important, if you look today at our Africa initiative, in the last 4 years, we've trained 40,000 people. We have soft loans, we have a soft loan commitment of $10 billion, which, we have met about 70% of it. We have a grant commitment of maybe $700 million. Now, you go to Africa. When I went to UNGA, when I met African leaders at other forums, including the Paris Peace Forum, where I think our our image has changed there. And the fact that we are today opening our embassies there, or all the new 18 embassies are all opening in Africa. That is also a statement.
So you're going to follow up with something on Latin America as well? You see, your Republic Day, you're going to have Brazilian president?
I don't speculate about visits or Republic Days. But yes, I think, the next 5 years, certainly I see a lot of room for much more to be done in Latin America and Caribbean.
Now, coming to the neighborhood, the third set of issues. Pakistan, yes, you're trying to confront the problem of terrorism. But there is a deeper question that, look, there is the bitter legacy of partition. And we have to live with Pakistan, whatever you say. And you also need to distinguish between Pakistani state and its people. So is there something beyond the question of terrorism, that how we think about reworking this in a structural way beyond the problems with the Pakistani state that you have?
Look, the fact is every government and every prime minister and probably every foreign minister has grappled with the Pakistan problem since the beginning. Okay? Everybody has tried to find a way forward. So, even today, the conundrum is not fundamentally different. And the fact is, you look at it, this government, this prime minister has probably done much bolder things even in trying to find a way forward. I mean, his visit to Lahore, for example, was, I mean, extraordinarily risky, both, I mean, it was politically risky, but even more than that, it was physically risky. But he did it. So the point is that it's not that, who doesn't want a good neighbor? But at the end of the day, the more you sort of run away from the reality that this neighbor has built an industry of terror to pressurize you, there's no point living in denial, because if you live in denial, he will only increase it. He thinks that it then got normalized. So I think holding the feet to the fire on this issue is very important, because without that, you're not going to get change. Now look at the last few years. See, for example, today the pressures which FATF has put. It's actually telling. So it won't happen overnight. But I think the fact that it has not happened, or they still use it as prolifically as they do, should not let, this is an issue where we have no choice but to do what we are doing. Because if we do anything else, we are failing our country.
On general neighborhood issues, there's been a strong criticism that, look, we're really losing the narrative in the neighborhood.
Really?
At least in the last 2 years, I mean, people have said, look, it's never been, India has been friendless in the neighborhood.
You're reading the wrong newspaper.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I also write in one of them. But the thing is, you don't buy that, or how do you answer the question that, look, we're not doing well enough in the neighborhood?
Look, no, I don't think, first of all, I don't think that's true, okay? I'll tell you why. Look back at the last few years, okay? I mean, we've just had an election this year in Bangladesh. We were not an issue. We have an election underway in Sri Lanka. We are not an issue. There was an election last year in Maldives. Even the incumbent who had issues with us kept saying, no, but I want an India first foreign policy. Okay. You have maybe a very complicated power arrangement in Myanmar, but both, all the parties in a sense are okay with us. So I think this idea that somewhere we are failing in the neighborhood is not true, and this is one assertion of it. Let me give you another. If you look today actually at the investments we are making in the neighborhood, it has changed the economy, or it is changing the economy of the neighborhood. And the sharpest sign of change you would see is in Bangladesh. Okay. But it's happening, to differing degrees in different places. I mean, we've just, for example, inaugurated a pipeline in Nepal. We are working on some important railway projects in Nepal, which will be coming on stream very, very quickly. With Sri Lanka, again, we have, we've been probably the largest development assistance partner, and we've done both, infrastructure restoration and, post-conflict rehabilitation. So the point I'm making is, people actually see you today put your money where your mouth is. They actually see that you got that right mix of working with the dispensation and power. Now, there are some realities, okay? I mean, since we all have a shared history and to some degree a shared sociology, there will be from time to time identity assertions. Now, we have to take that in our stride. So, I don't expect, constant ringing praises of India. But I think the sense that somewhere something is going wrong, I would just plain disagree with you.
One question though, I think on whether it is neighborhood in South Asia or more broadly the Indian Ocean, delivery on projects, delivery on, commitments that we make, is there need for some structural change in the way we deliver, project implementation in the neighborhood?
That is actually, look, first of all, bear two cautions in mind. What you do abroad cannot be that different from what you do in the country. Okay, that's my first caution. The second is that this was a new area for us. Okay, when we first began some of these projects. Frankly, we were kind of winging our way. I'm talking maybe 15 years ago. So we've also had lessons learnt on it. But today, I can tell you that actually our delivery on projects is phenomenal. I mean, next time we go to Mauritius, ask them how quickly we built that metro. Or you look today at Afghanistan. I mean, under the most challenging conditions. Conditions which European countries were not willing to work. But we built a dam. It was the first dam anybody built in 70 years in that country. We brought power to Kabul. We built the parliament building. We built, across, we built that Zeran Dalaram road. So, and again, I would say in the latest one we did in Nepal, we were actually ahead of schedule, which was the Amleganj, the POL pipeline. So, I mean, I grant you there is scope for improvement, but I would also caution you working abroad and working as per rules. We can't do things which some competitors can do. But keeping all that in mind, I would actually, with a fairly clear conscience, defend our record, but concede that there is room for improvement. And by the way, one of the changes we've done is also to get technical people into the foreign ministry, so that, that whole project conceptualization is very much better.
We're running against time, but I'll just have two last questions. I mean, I think one is on the many countries are looking to India to do more on security. I mean, I think you talked about HADR, humanitarian assistance, first responder to disasters, etc. But here in the Gulf, where your relationship has transformed, but the Gulf countries are also, in your recent visits, both UAE as well as Saudi Arabia, both of them are saying, what role is India going to play in the security of the region? So are you prepared to shed the traditional inhibition to do more, because Trump himself has called for an international coalition, coalition for protecting sea lines. Given your high stakes, given the willingness of some, given the eagerness of some to have you do more for security, are we ready to respond, or are we still risk averse when it comes to doing security in the neighborhood?
Look, I would be careful in this domain. And here I speak with the experience of someone who spent 2 years with the IPKF. So, and this is me personally, I'm not speaking government policy. I learned the hard way the dangers of having boots on the ground abroad. And my personal inclination is to be conservative in that regard. I would like to think through all the risks, etc. Having said that, I do recognize it is a changing world, and that, we are moving into an era where the assumption that other people, that the environment will take care of itself or somebody else will take care of it will be challenged. Having said that, now let me give you a few examples. I don't know how many people know this. We are deployed in the Gulf. The Navy has been deployed since there were problems on, tankers being attacked. So it's not that we haven't responded where we've had to, but often people are kind of fanciful about it. They talk as though deployment's very easy, that actually other countries want to. Countries are also very careful what they ask. So in real life, foreign deployments are less common than you would imagine.
So moving to the multilateralism issue, on climate change, you've seen India break away from the traditional position, Mr. No, it's not my problem, somebody else did it, let them solve it, to one where you actually said, look, we're going to be part of the solution. So there is a seemingly more positive attitude to multilateralism. You recently participated in the Alliance for Multilateralism that Germany and France have taken the initiative. So, but at the same time, you see India still at discomfort on global trade negotiations, on other multilateral arrangements that come. So have we finally crossed the hump on being actively engaged in multilateral institutions?
I think I would hesitate to put multilateral per se as a good or bad sort of adjective. I mean, meaning, do I buy into it or not? Because if you look at the examples that you've cited, yes, in Paris we took a I would say, a very important role, because we finally came to the conclusion that probably that was the most pragmatic way forward, and there'd be some progress in that way of working as opposed to what had been attempted but did not succeed earlier, largely because of the lack of commitment of the northern countries there. And it's interesting, since you mentioned it, I was in, when going to the UN this time, I saw in this climate action tracker that we are one of the few countries who actually kept to our nationally determined contributions made in Paris. A whole lot of countries, including in Europe, have not. Why would I be pro-multilateral? Yes. I'll be pro-multilateral because at the end of the day, the world is better governed by rules. And we are all said and done, we are a rule-abiding society at home. And generally, people behave outside like they behave at home. So I would make a case for having rules. I think having rules, however imperfect, are better than not having rules. I think today it is an important point of commonality with Europe. One of the reasons we took a positive view on the Alliance for Multilateralism, which for those of you who don't know is a Franco-German-led initiative, was a sense that multilateralism, rules across the board were under pressure. But having said that, when you say, we have been reticent on multilateral trading negotiations, maybe you're partly right, but you also please understand, often the trading negotiations are fashioned in a way in which they advance the interests of a particular set of countries. So, I'm not going to enthusiastically embrace a negotiation of which I'm the target. So, a lot of it today is also the ability, it's interesting. Actually, in real life, we have not always stood up where we should have stood up. And again, I come back to RCEP. At the end of the day in RCEP, we had to take that call. Are we getting enough for us to buy into RCEP or are we not? And frankly, the downside of it was so much bigger than the upside. We took that call.
So the corollary to that is, are we ready to do the reforms that we need to make our industry more competitive? So that takes you back to what we do at home as central to how we deal with the world.
No, look, absolutely. There's no question. Diplomacy is not conducted in a vacuum. It is finally built on an economy, on a polity, on your national strengths. No question about that.
Final question. I think on some of the new issues that are emerging, for example, the Chinese talk about a law enforcement diplomacy. There is much talk about military diplomacy where the traditional instruments of defense and diplomacy are combined. Is India prepared to, or technology diplomacy where, you yourself have been involved in the nuclear stuff. What are the kind of internal change do you need to do to cope with, for example, on the digital side, on the security side, on the law enforcement? One of the key ingredients, I would think, better coordination with the Home Ministry, better coordination with, Defense Ministry, the tech ministries. Is there a thinking to revamp, rearrange so that the new global issues that we can deal with them in a more effective way?
Short answer, yes. Long answer, I would say, if I were to identify a single challenge of policy making, it is, the need for better integration horizontally. And it's not unique to India. It's the history of the world. We probably need it more than other people because we are in a particular sort of cusp of change where that is required. And I see that today in a variety of ways. And often the solutions are actually our own time-tested institutions. It is not that the integration mechanisms are absent in our system. It's just that for a variety of reasons, people didn't use it. But I can say, right now, I could say that earlier bureaucratically. Today, I can say that politically. I think today the dispensation has a very tight element of integration. It is very much a group think. People don't, say, for example, something like, say, RCEP. All of us were involved in that discussion. So we don't, there's a conscious attempt not to address the big challenges of the day in silos departmentally. And I think, again, that's one of those infinite things. There's always room for improvement.
So in the end, I would say, would you agree with the view that, look, reform is the answer to India's external challenges, because if you don't change yourself within, your ability to cope with a very rapidly changing world is going to be tested.
I think that was the thrust of my talk.
Okay. Reform, reform, reform. Please join me in thanking the Minister.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that insightful conversation. Thank you, Dr. Rajamohan. And may I request Dr. Jaishankar to please remain on stage. I would now like to invite our presenting partner this evening, Mr. Madhusudan Agarwal, Vice Chairman and Co-founder of Ajanta Pharma and Samta Foundation, and Honorary Consul of Uganda, Mumbai, on stage to present Dr. Jaishankar with a token of appreciation. Thank you, Mr. Madhusudan. I would now like to invite Mr. Ramnath Goenka, Executive Director, the Express Group, on stage to present the closing address. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening. I'm quite certain that I'm not the only one here who was surprised at the sight of Dr. Jaishankar taking the stage in front of the Rashtrapati Bhavan at the swearing-in of this government earlier this year. And that's for two reasons. I have two reasons, I'll hear yours. First, for news people like us, not getting even a whiff of such a wildcard portfolio assignment to at least a few days in advance takes some getting used to. We are, after all, members of the Khan Market gang. And second, because India has almost always seen generalists running key portfolios. It was a welcome change to see a domain expert like Dr. Jaishankar given charge. And today we are all lucky to have gotten this rare glimpse of his incredible knowledge and expertise. And if I can be a little immodest, that the minister gave the Express the opportunity to host his first private media interaction shows that he too values domain expertise. Ladies and gentlemen, in these polarized times of noisy, unreliable news, we try to draw a distinction between ourselves and the rest of news media. The fact that we have a packed house this evening once again disproves the conventional wisdom that dumbing down content is the only way to get eyeballs. The fact that even in 2019, we are the only growing English newspaper in the city of New Delhi. And the fact that the Indian Express Group today is one of the world's largest digital news groups, reaching 148 million unique users a month in 6 languages across the world. I think all goes to show the large demand there is for intelligent, credible content and for patient, nuanced, and enriching conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jaishankar isn't the only one in this establishment that chose the Express as their first private media engagement. In 2014, late Arun Jaitley's first private interaction after taking over as Defense and Finance Ministers, taking over the Defense and Finance Ministries was at the Express Adda. Raghuram Rajan's first as RBI Governor was at the first Ramnath Goenka Memorial Lecture in 2016. Pranab Mukherjee's last before retiring, and Mr. Ranjan Gogoi's last before taking the role of CGI were the second and third Ramnath Goenka Memorial Lectures in 2017 and 2018. Nirmala Sitharamanji's first interaction as Defense Minister was also at an Express Adda in 2018, and her first interaction after becoming Finance Minister was at the Express Adda last week. The fact that we have had the privilege of hosting these accomplished individuals only reinforces our belief that no matter what changes in the news ecosystem, the only way Ramnath Goenka's brand of journalism thrives at least another 87 years is by constantly investing in quality content and by being the natural source of thought-provoking conversations like the one we had today. So on behalf of my father, Vivek Goenka, Dr. Jaishankar, thank you for taking the time to prepare and deliver this excellent address. Sitting in the audience, I thought of at least 4 headlines from his address, so I think the editors are going to thoroughly enjoy bringing out tomorrow's paper. In less than 45 minutes, not only did you take us on a journey around the world, you summarized India's relationship with each major region over 10 to 15-year time periods, discussed the strengths and weaknesses of each phase of Indian foreign policy, and very candidly mentioned the mistakes and displayed the energy to follow through on some of the brave changes required on Indian foreign policy. Thank you also to Dr. Raja Mohan, clearly one of the finest minds on foreign policy in the country, and someone whose knowledge and insights find a natural home in the opinion pages of the Indian Express. Quick acknowledgements to our partners, Samta Foundation, Wonder Cement, and Vision IAS. And finally, thank you all for being here with us today. Very good evening to you all.
Sir, Mr. Goenka and Dr. Jaishankar, please don't leave the stage yet. May I request Mr. Anand Goenka to present a special memento and a portrait to Dr. Jaishankar. This portrait has been made by Shyam Kumar Prasad, Chief Illustrator, Financial Express. Thank you so much. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, we come to a close this evening. I'd like to thank our speaker, Dr. Jaishankar, and Dr. Raja Mohan for the thoughtful conversation, and all of you for being engaged, keen listeners. Also, I'd like to acknowledge our partners, presenting partner Samta Foundation and associate partners Wonder Cement and Vision IAS, without whose support this evening would not have been a grand success. With that, I bid you good night. Thank you.